In January of 1947, Los Angeles was cool under a winter sun. The city buzzed with the promise of glamour, fame, and fresh starts. It was a new year, just 2 years after the end of World War II, and the nation was shifting from the fog of conflict into the bright lights of peace and prosperity. But on the quiet morning of January 15th, in a vacant lot on the edge of South Norton Avenue, that bright promise dimmed into something far more chilling. A mother pushing her baby in a stroller stopped. She squinted into the distance, her breath catching. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, split at the waist, clean, almost posed. But as she stepped closer, horror gripped her like a vice. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a young woman, bisected, bloodless. A grotesque, almost surgical horror laid out in plain sight. The scream she let out shattered the morning calm, and with it began one of the most shocking, perplexing, and grisly murder investigations in American history. The woman would soon be identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, known to her acquaintances, and eventually the world, as the Black Dahlia. Post-war Los Angeles was a city living two lives. On one hand, it was the land of movie stars and golden promises. Palm trees waved like sirens, calling to young men and women across America, whispering that dreams were just one lucky audition away. On the other hand, it was a city drowning in shadows, poverty, corruption, and the mounting tension between the image Hollywood sold and the harsh reality many newcomers faced. Elizabeth Short was one of them. She had raven black hair, porcelain skin, and a striking beauty that drew comparisons to starlets of the time. She dreamed not just of fame, but of being seen, of becoming something more than the girl from Medford, Massachusetts. But her story wasn't one of silver screen stardom. It was a story of desperation, displacement, and a young woman navigating a city that promised everything and delivered nothing except danger. Elizabeth's life didn't begin in tragedy, but it didn't shy away from it either. Born in 1924 in the working-class suburb of Medford, Massachusetts, Elizabeth's early years were marked by promise, until her father, Cleo Short, disappeared. One day, he left his family without warning. His car was found abandoned near a bridge, and everyone assumed the worst, suicide. Her mother, Phoebe, was left alone with 5 daughters and a shattered future. Years later, Elizabeth would discover the unthinkable. Her father wasn't dead. He had faked his death and started a new life in California. That kind of betrayal doesn't just cut deep, it defines you. And for Elizabeth, it left an emotional scar that would never fully heal. The need to be loved, to be valued, to belong, these weren't passing wishes. They became her driving force. Plagued by chronic bronchitis and severe asthma, Elizabeth was in and out of hospitals during her adolescence. Her illness meant cold winters in Massachusetts were dangerous. So every year, she was sent to Florida to recover in warmer climates. It created a life in motion, always shifting, never rooted. In Florida, she caught attention for her looks. Men were drawn to her, and she wasn't blind to the way her beauty opened doors or closed them if she wasn't careful. There were rumors of a short-lived marriage to a military man, but nothing stuck, nothing held. She drifted Boston, Florida, Long Beach, Santa Barbara. She tried waitressing, modeling, even dabbled in acting, but nothing clicked. She was always just on the edge of something, but never quite there. Friends and acquaintances described her as sweet, gentle, naive. Others claimed she lived with a sort of tragic romanticism, always chasing the ideal of a better life that never seemed to land in her lap. By the time Elizabeth Short arrived in Los Angeles in 1946, she was one of thousands of young women swept westward by the glittering myth of Hollywood. But in truth, she had no money, no steady job. She drifted from couch to couch, often relying on the kindness or intentions of strangers, especially men. She was a dreamer with no real foothold in a city that chewed up and spit out dreamers every single day. She wrote long letters home to her mother in Massachusetts, insisting everything was fine. She told stories of auditions, of being discovered, of a career just around the corner. But those letters hid the truth. She was lost. She was vulnerable. And someone dark saw that. Elizabeth Short was about to become a name no one would ever forget. But not because of the roles she played or the films she made. It would be because of the horror that found her in Los Angeles. The city of dreams was about to show its nightmare face. January 9, 1947, the day Elizabeth Short stepped into the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The air was heavy with that midwinter stillness, a deceptive calm that masks what's coming. She had a suitcase in hand. It wasn't much, some clothes, a few photos, letters from admirers, and dreams she still hadn't given up on. She had arranged to meet a former boyfriend, a married man named Robert Red Manley. They had driven from San Diego together, and according to him, he thought she looked different, pale, distant, maybe even scared. They parted ways outside the Biltmore. Red claimed he watched her walk inside and disappear into the crowd. It was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short, alive. The Biltmore Hotel, once a glamorous haven for Hollywood royalty, became the last place anyone would ever see her breathing. After that, she vanished. And this is where her story begins to splinter. Some say she was headed out to meet someone, perhaps a date, perhaps a contact in the film industry. Others suggest she had nowhere to go and was stalling for time. Whatever her intentions, Elizabeth never checked into a room. She never used the phone. There are no official records placing her anywhere after that moment. The city swallowed her whole, but the mystery deepens. Days later, her suitcase turned up. Not at the Biltmore, not at a friend's place, but in a Greyhound bus station locker, hidden away. Inside, authorities found letters, some handwritten, others typed, many addressed to men. It was clear Elizabeth had been reaching out to anyone who might help her. Some were flirty, others desperate. She had also left behind a collection of photographs, many of them carefully posed. Her black clothing, elegant, severe Hollywood chic, was folded with precision. Someone, it seemed, didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to vanish completely. The LAPD began to pull on every thread they could find. Who had she met that night? Why was the suitcase hidden? And most hauntingly of all, what happened to Elizabeth Short between January 9th and January 15th? Over the following weeks, Los Angeles became a city drunk on its own terror. The newspapers couldn't print fast enough. The Black Dahlia, they called her, a name reportedly drawn from her black wardrobe and a popular noir film playing at the time. The Blue Dahlia. The name stuck. The myth exploded. And then the sightings began. Dozens of people swore they saw Elizabeth at diners, on buses, wandering downtown. One claimed she was hitchhiking near Sunset Boulevard. Another said she'd seen her on the arm of a well-dressed man in a velvet coat. The LAPD chased every lead, hundreds of them. They set up tip lines, posted flyers, hauled in suspects, and slowly, painfully, the reality set in. None of the sightings were real. Elizabeth wasn't wandering the streets. She wasn't calling for help. She wasn't hiding from anything or anyone. She was already gone, and someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened to her. Investigators began combing through her past, tracing old lovers, ex-roommates, men who had bought her meals, lent her money, offered her jobs that didn't exist. The LAPD interviewed more than 150 suspects in the first few weeks alone. Nothing stuck. The killer, whoever they were, hadn't just destroyed Elizabeth's body. They had erased her final days, too. Every hour between the Biltmore lobby and that vacant lot in Leimert Park was a black hole of silence. It was as if she'd been plucked from the world. Not just killed, but erased. And in that silence grew a storm, a media circus, a wave of fear, a citywide obsession with a young woman most of them had never met, yet suddenly couldn't forget. And one haunting question echoed through Los Angeles like a scream in a canyon. Who killed the Black Dahlia? And why? January 15th, 1947. Just past 10 o'clock in the morning. In a quiet, undeveloped patch of land in Leimert Park, a neighborhood in South Los Angeles, a young mother was pushing her baby in a stroller. She was looking for nothing more than a peaceful morning walk, a break from the noise of the city. That's when she saw it. At first glance, it looked like a store mannequin, something from a window display, left behind or dumped without care. The skin was pale, unnaturally so. The body was posed intentionally. The arms raised slightly above the head, legs spread apart. A haunting, almost theatrical arrangement. She stepped closer. Then came the scream. What she had found wasn't a mannequin. It was the butchered, mutilated body of a young woman, nude, severed cleanly at the waist, and drained entirely of blood. The skin was so pallid it seemed to glow under the morning sun. There was no blood at the scene. None. No drag marks. No splatter. It was clinical. Almost surgical. Whoever had done this had not killed her there. She had been murdered elsewhere and her body transported, displayed, with care, with purpose. This wasn't panic. This wasn't rushed. This was planned. The police arrived swiftly, and what they saw chilled even the most hardened detectives to the bone. The victim's mouth had been slashed from ear to ear in a grotesque, permanent grin, what would later be called a Glasgow smile. Her intestines were tucked beneath her lower back. There were bruises and cuts, rope marks on her wrists, signs of prolonged torture. Her body had been scrubbed clean, bathed, possibly with gasoline to remove evidence. Her limbs were stiff, as if posed post-mortem. She was a message, an act of theatrical violence so deliberate it spoke volumes in silence. The press descended almost instantly. Camera flashes lit up the crime scene as detectives tried, in vain, to secure the perimeter. It was too late. The image of Elizabeth Short, what was left of her, would be burned into the psyche of America forever. 35:00, 45:00, Autopsy Deep Dive. At the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, the autopsy began. What unfolded under the sterile lights of that morgue would send shockwaves through the law enforcement community. This was no ordinary murder. This was something else entirely. Elizabeth had been cut in half using a technique called a hemicorporectomy, a method of bisection that severs the body through the lower lumbar spine, just between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. It's a rare procedure, one almost exclusively known to medical professionals or those with surgical training. There was no splintering of the bone, no hesitation marks. The cut was clean, precise. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They didn't butcher her, they dissected her. And the horror didn't stop there. Her body bore signs of extensive trauma before death. Lacerations to her face, her scalp, bruising on her head, possibly from repeated blunt force. Rope marks suggested she had been bound, perhaps suspended. But it was the wounds to her lower body that were most disturbing. Unspeakable acts of mutilation, violations that hinted not just at hatred, but obsession. The kind of violence that speaks of power, control, a need to dominate and destroy. Tissue samples showed she had been fed before she was killed, suggesting she may have been held for some time, possibly days, between her disappearance and her death. The level of decomposition aligned with that theory. Shockingly, her official cause of death was not the bisection. She died from hemorrhaging caused by repeated blows to the head, meaning she had still been alive during much of what had been done to her. There was no sign of sexual assault, at least not in the traditional sense. But make no mistake, this was a sexually motivated crime, twisted and horrific. In the end, the coroner's office compiled an extensive report, one of the most detailed in LAPD history at the time. But for all its revelations, it offered no clear path forward. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon. Only one thing was certain. Elizabeth Short had been murdered by someone who was calm, methodical, and likely enjoyed what they had done. This was not a moment of rage. This was a performance. And the city of Los Angeles? It was the stage. The moment the police realized who the victim was, the gears of an enormous investigation began to turn. They had a name, Elizabeth Short. Within an hour, her fingerprints, already on file from a previous arrest in Santa Barbara, had confirmed her identity. It was one of the first cases in Los Angeles where fingerprint identification happened at this speed, thanks in part to FBI cooperation. In 1947, that was revolutionary. But the gravity of what they were facing quickly dwarfed any celebration of procedure. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a jilted lover lashing out in a moment of heat. This was a methodical, heinous act of violence that pointed to a killer who planned every step, who studied anatomy, who took the time not only to clean the body, but to pose it. Within 24 hours, the LAPD had assigned their top detectives. The FBI was looped in. The media was ravenous. The public? Terrified. Tips began flooding in. The police station phones rang off the hook. And in a decision that would haunt the case for decades, the LAPD opened the doors wide. They talked to everyone. And when you ask a city to speak, it doesn't whisper. It roars. Soon, there were suspects. Dozens. Then hundreds. Over 150 people were formally interviewed. Doctors, butchers, military personnel, lovers, liars, wannabe actors, strangers who just wanted to be a part of the spectacle. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a name. Everyone claimed to know what happened. But none of them did. The LAPD was drowning, not in silence, but in noise. And buried within that noise was the faint whisper of truth. But finding it? Like catching smoke. Then came the letters. Creepy. Taunting. Some were handwritten. Others typed. All claimed the same thing. I'm the one who killed the Black Dahlia. The most notorious came in a crudely addressed envelope, sent to the Los Angeles Examiner. It contained personal items, Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photos, and an address book with pages torn out. It was chilling. It was also likely staged. The letter was signed, "Heaven is here." Another note followed. Here it is. Turning in Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger. No one showed up. These weren't confessions. They were games. The work of a person who craved the spotlight, who reveled in the attention as much as the crime itself. But the letters weren't the only thing flooding in. People began confessing. Over the next few months, dozens, even hundreds, of individuals came forward, swearing they were responsible for Elizabeth's murder. One of the most famous was a man named Daniel S. Voorhees, a drifter who inserted himself into the case claiming vivid knowledge of the killing. The LAPD spent precious time and resources chasing his stories, only to find contradictions, gaps, and outright lies. Voorhees wasn't alone. One man confessed because he wanted a warm place to sleep. Another said he'd done it so he could get famous. Yet another claimed he was under the influence of voices. When he killed her, he wasn't even in California at the time. In total, over 60 people confessed. But the police knew the person who really did this wouldn't need to confess. Not like that. He or she was smarter than that, more calculated, possibly even watching from afar, sipping coffee, reading headlines, and smiling. The truth was slipping. Elizabeth was gone. The evidence was thin. The public was hungry for justice. And the LAPD? They were standing at the edge of something they'd never encountered before, a murder that wasn't just brutal. It was a spectacle, and the killer was just getting started. By the late 1940s, Los Angeles had many faces. Some glittered in fame, others hid behind smoke and shadows. And in that strange cityscape stood a man who would come to personify both. Dr. George Hill Hodel, a name that, at the time, meant little to the public. But behind closed doors, within the corridors of the LAPD, that name carried weight and suspicion. George Hodel was no average citizen. He was a highly intelligent, well-connected physician, fluent in several languages, well-traveled, a lover of surrealist art and avant-garde philosophy. He lived in the famed Soden House, a Mayan revival mansion in the heart of Hollywood, filled with secrets, shadows, and stories that would take decades to unravel. But what made him more than an eccentric socialite was his past. He had studied surgery. He had access to hospitals. He was trained meticulously in human anatomy, the same kind of anatomy needed to perform something as surgically precise as a hemicorporectomy. The LAPD took notice. Hodel was already on their radar for something else, something darker. In 1945, he was under quiet investigation for incest, after one of his daughters accused him of abuse. The trial ended with his acquittal, but not his escape from scrutiny. 2 years later, When Elizabeth Short was found mutilated, scrubbed clean, and bisected with surgical skill, detectives circled back. Was this doctor, a man with knowledge, access, and a history of deviant behavior, responsible for one of the most infamous killings in American history? They didn't have proof. Not yet. But they had something better. Suspicion. And suspicion, in Los Angeles, was enough to start surveillance. Decades passed. George Hodel died in 1999. And for a while, it seemed the mystery of the Black Dahlia would be buried with him. Until someone reopened the casket. Not a detective, not a journalist, but his own son, Steve Hodel. A former LAPD homicide investigator himself, Steve had lived a life shadowed by his father's brilliance and his secrets. After George's death, Steve inherited boxes of his belongings, photographs, letters, documents, and slowly, disturbingly, a picture began to form. Steve believed his father had murdered Elizabeth Short, not just as a theory, as a conclusion, a chilling certainty based on what he found and what he remembered. In his research, Steve uncovered a series of photographs. One of them, he believed, showed Elizabeth herself. The resemblance was haunting. While some experts have disputed the identification, for Steve, it was the first brick in a wall he would spend the rest of his life building. But it was what the LAPD had done before George Hodel's death that changed everything. In the early 1950s, LAPD had wired Hodel's house. They bugged his phone, planted listening devices in his walls, and what they captured was unnerving. On one tape, George is heard saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." His secretary, Ruth Spaulding, had died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, an overdose. But now, that death sounded more like cleanup than tragedy. On another recording, Hodel was heard referencing medical procedures, discussions of abortion, and abstract references to power, death, and manipulation. He was never arrested, never charged. But the LAPD's interest in him was real, quiet, persistent, and in Steve Hodel's eyes, overwhelming. He published a book, Black Dahlia Avenger. It laid out a meticulous, if controversial, case against his father. A timeline, motives, physical access, a series of murders that, Steve argued, fit a pattern pointing to George. To some, it was the breakthrough the case had been waiting for. To others, it was a son chasing ghosts. Not everyone was convinced. Larry Harnish, a Los Angeles Times copy editor turned Dahlia historian, read Steve Hodel's book and wasn't buying it. He believed the timeline didn't hold up. The photos were inconclusive. The alleged connections between George Hodel and Elizabeth Short? Circumstantial at best. He wasn't alone. Many critics argued that the LAPD's surveillance tapes, while eerie, were vague, more philosophical than confessional. They believed the secretary's death, though tragic, wasn't a cover-up. They pointed out that despite all of Steve's research, no new physical evidence ever surfaced. No DNA, no murder weapon, no smoking gun, and most damning of all, George Hodel was never brought in for questioning, never arrested, and never publicly named a suspect during the original investigation. So who's right? Was George Hodel a brilliant, twisted man who orchestrated the perfect murder and got away with it? Or was he simply a convenient target, an eccentric figure woven into a dark legend by time, fear, and a son desperate to explain the shadows of his past? The truth is murky, but one thing is clear. Whether he was guilty or not, George Hodel would never escape the shadow of the Black Dahlia, and neither would Los Angeles. Years before Elizabeth Short's mutilated body was discovered in Los Angeles, a very different city was dealing with its own string of horrors. Cleveland, Ohio, the 1930s. A series of gruesome killings, 12, possibly 13 victims, many of them dismembered, decapitated, and dumped like garbage. The press dubbed the killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. And despite investigations by legendary lawman Eliot Ness himself, the case was never solved. But decades later, as details of the Black Dahlia murder emerged, comparisons were inevitable. The surgical cuts, the body dismemberment, The absence of blood at the scene. The dehumanization. Were these two killers the same man? Some theorists believed yes. That the butcher of Cleveland didn't stop in the Midwest, but moved west, changed cities, changed names, and struck again in Los Angeles under a new identity. There were striking anatomical parallels in how the bodies were handled. Both killers seemed unfazed by gore. Both left behind puzzles, not evidence. Yet the authorities, at the time and now, have largely dismissed the connection. They saw no firm link between the cities, no trail connecting the two crime waves. For law enforcement, it was an interesting theory, but nothing more. Still, the whispers remain. That maybe, just maybe, the monster didn't die in Cleveland. He evolved. George Hodel wasn't the only man with a dark cloud overhead. There were others. First, there was Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub and theater owner in Hollywood. Elizabeth had stayed at his home. They were close, some said too close. She had turned down romantic advances, and her address book had his name in it, highlighted. Hansen denied involvement. The LAPD questioned him, but never charged him. Was he just another man orbiting Elizabeth's beauty? Or was he hiding something? Then came Leslie Dillon, a bellhop with a background in mortuary science and a fascination with crime scenes. He wrote to the LAPD, claiming to have insights into the murder. But soon, his role shifted from informant to suspect. Dillon's knowledge was oddly specific, too specific, and yet the department let him go. It was sloppy. In fact, internal files later revealed that high-ranking officers may have deliberately shut down the investigation to protect reputations, possibly even protect one of their own. The suspicion wasn't just that the killer was known. It was that the killer was protected. Then, in more outlandish theories, names like Bugsy Siegel, the notorious mobster, entered the conversation. Some speculated Elizabeth had gotten involved with dangerous people who didn't take kindly to rejection or loose ends. But these claims were thin, reliant more on myth than fact. The idea of Bugsy being involved seemed pulled more from noir fiction than forensic truth. Still, with each suspect, one thing was clear. Elizabeth had been surrounded by men, some helpful, some harmful, some who claimed to love her, others who barely knew her name. And somewhere among them was a killer. Time passed. The city changed. New generations were born. But the Black Dahlia case never faded. And then, in recent years, a ripple in the silence. A new book emerged, Sisters in Death. It introduced a theory both chilling and compelling, that Elizabeth Short's murder was not isolated. That another woman, Jean French, murdered just weeks after Elizabeth bore similar wounds. That both women were linked. That both were victims of the same hand. The book's author proposed an entirely new suspect, unnamed to the public. A man who had resurfaced in recent years, drawing renewed attention from amateur sleuths and retired detectives alike. Details were scarce, deliberately withheld. The theory was that this man had remained hidden in plain sight, shielded by time, and possibly by institutional blind spots. For some, the theory offered new hope. For others, just another twist in a story already riddled with detours. But there's a truth here, buried beneath the speculation and the headlines. Elizabeth Short wasn't the first. She might not have been the last. And the questions that have haunted this case for nearly a century aren't just about who did it, but why the city of Los Angeles never found the answer. The moment Elizabeth Short's body was identified, her story was no longer hers. It belonged to the headlines. The city's newspapers descended on the case like vultures on a fresh kill. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Herald Express, the Times, all of them raced for scoops, digging for details, spinning tragedy into front-page drama. And with that frenzy came a new name, the Black Dahlia. It wasn't something her family called her. It wasn't a name she had chosen. It was born from the press. An eerie blend of the black outfits Elizabeth was known to wear and the popular 1946 noir film The Blue Dahlia. The name stuck, not just because it sounded poetic, but because it echoed with darkness. It turned Elizabeth from a real person into a myth, a mystery, a headline. Journalists began fabricating details, stretching facts into fables. They described her as a party girl, a seductress, a drifter. Some even claimed she lived a double life, peddling the idea that she led men into dangerous games. None of it was proven. None of it mattered. The public didn't want Elizabeth Short the woman. They wanted the Black Dahlia, the character, the symbol, the tragic beauty at the heart of a blood-soaked Hollywood fable. The press took liberties. One reporter allegedly pretended to be Elizabeth's grieving mother just to get personal information from Boston authorities before the family even knew she was dead. Others stole content from rival publications, desperate to keep their readers hooked. It wasn't journalism. It was theater. Each article added another layer to the legend, while stripping away what little truth was left. The woman who once wrote hopeful letters to her mother about a career in Hollywood was now fodder for a media machine she never got the chance to join. Elizabeth was gone, but the Black Dahlia had been born. Over the decades, the Black Dahlia became more than just a crime. She became an icon. Books were written, films inspired, artists obsessed, poets speculated. In 1987, author James Ellroy published his novel The Black Dahlia, a gritty, fictionalized reimagining of the case, filtered through a lens of noir. Ellroy, whose own mother was murdered when he was young, poured every drop of his darkness into the story. It was brutal, stylized, hypnotic. In 2006, Brian De Palma adapted the novel into a film. Critics were split, but the myth continued. The real Elizabeth Short had vanished from the public memory. In her place stood a figure of noir fantasy, the glamorous, doomed woman lost to the shadows of 1940s Los Angeles. She was the perfect fit for a city that loved mystery, sex, and violence in equal measure. The Black Dahlia became part of Hollywood's cultural DNA. She was referenced in films, TV shows, novels, comics. Her story blended into urban legend. She stood alongside Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Sharon Tate, figures whose lives were cut short, whose deaths became part of their fame. But unlike them, Elizabeth never had a chance to speak. Her name became shorthand for something bigger than herself. A warning, a riddle, a tragedy that echoed louder than any role she could have played on screen. Los Angeles gave birth to the myth of the Black Dahlia, and in doing so, it buried Elizabeth Short forever beneath layers of smoke and starlight. Nearly 8 decades have passed, and yet the case remains open. The LAPD still keeps the Black Dahlia murder file in its archives. Officially unsolved, technically active, but unofficially, the hope has grown dim. The FBI has said as much. They've acknowledged the difficulty, the sheer distance in time, the lack of reliable evidence, the degradation of what little physical material might remain. They've explored DNA testing, some strands of hair, some trace fibers, but nothing conclusive, nothing definitive. And unless someone steps forward with a confession and the evidence to back it, this may remain what it has always been, a ghost, a mystery frozen in time. The original detectives are long gone. The generation that first read those horrifying headlines has grown old. But still, we ask the question, who killed Elizabeth Short, and why? Because the truth isn't just buried under dust and age. It's buried under fear, lies, mistakes, and silence. So why do we still talk about it? Why does this one case, one victim, still haunt us all these years later? Because it speaks to something deep, something human. Elizabeth Short wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't famous. She was, in the most honest sense, just like anyone. Young, lost, hopeful, trying to make something of herself in a city that promised everything and delivered nothing. Her murder forced the world to look at the shadows behind the Hollywood sign, to see the danger behind the dream, the people behind the glamour. And it reminded us, brutally, that not every story gets closure. But her story also sparked something else. It inspired generations of investigators, writers, podcasters, armchair sleuths, people driven not by gore or fascination, but by justice, by a need to give her a voice. Because somewhere out there, the truth still exists, buried in a file, hidden in a memory, whispered in a name, and maybe one day someone will find it. But until then, we remember her not just as the Black Dahlia, but as Elizabeth Short, a daughter, a dreamer, a woman who deserved so much more than the ending she got, and whose silence still speaks louder than words. So now, we turn it over to you. After everything you've heard, every theory, every suspect, every dead end, who do you believe killed Elizabeth Short? Was it the surgeon in the shadows, Dr. George Hodel? The jilted club owner, Mark Hansen? The oddball bellhop, Leslie Dillon? Or someone we've never even considered? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And if you're not already subscribed, now's the time. Hit that bell so you never miss an episode. Because we're just getting started.